All right, so we're going to do one class today on Jewish art. There's not a lot because of the second commandment. The Jewish people really took this literally. So before the time of Christ, this was a real prohibition against any sort of graven image. It's pretty obvious you could not depict God himself. You didn't do that. You didn't even say the name God, right? You didn't say the word God. What did the Jews say instead? What was their term? Yahweh. What does that mean?
God.
Nope.
Chosen.
No, it means I am. I am. So this is why when Christ was standing in front of the high priest, when he was taken for his passion and he was put in front of the high priest, and Caiaphas was asking, who are you? What is the deal? And Christ said, before Abraham and Isaac, I am. That's why it was such a big deal. That's why it was such a blasphemy on their end. So the second commandment is taken literally. You should not make unto me any graven image. So in Jewish art, we're not going to see a lot of depictions of people. We're not going to see depictions of Moses. We're not going to see depictions of the prophets. We're going to see a lot of symbolism. We're going to see a lot of objects. We're going to see some people later on. I'll explain to you about that. But the reason why the Jews had so much interest in words, you're going to see a lot of written words on their artwork. God did not, up until this time, up until the time of Christ, he didn't show himself, right? How did God make his presence known in the Old Testament? Throw out a few examples.
Prophets.
No. How did he show himself? Like how did the burning bush, right? Fire,
Miracles.
right? What was another way? When the Israelites were being led out of Egypt.
Oh, the parting of the Red Sea.
No,
The food that fell from the sky.
no, that wasn't a depiction of God. The what?
The plagues and stuff.
Not the plagues. It was, they were led out of Egypt during the daytime with a pillar of fire, or a column of smoke. And then during the night, they were led by a pillar of fire.
Is it like a literal floating pillar of fire?
We don't know.
That's so cool.
That's not like
But what
So-
does the Bible say? That it was just a pillar.
It was a
of fire.
pillar of fire. Yeah, so we don't know beyond that. So he didn't manifest himself in any sort of a human form. It was all through these other signs and wonders. Remember, Moses goes up to the mountain, and there's clouds, there's lightning, there's thunder, right? That's it. And Moses hears the voice, and that's about it. So he didn't show himself in human form. The Jews said, God is making his presence known to us through his words. So that's why words are so important. That's why depicting God as Yahweh, as I am, that's why they did it that way. By the time the Talmud was written, and we can go into a lot about Jewish history, but the Talmud was basically like the rule book, right? The interpretation of the scriptures. So we had the scriptures, the Old Testament, which is pretty similar to what we have today in the Old Testament. But then there's the Talmud. The Talmud is like the teachings, right? These are the teachings of the rule book, how to live a Jewish life. So by the time the Talmud was written, the acceptance or rejection of idolatry was a litmus test for Jewish identity. There's this whole section of the Talmud that talks about strange worship. Remember, people at the time, other pagan religions at the time, had gods and goddesses, right? They had idols. And so this was the thing that set the Jewish people apart. We will not worship any other idols. We won't worship anything. That's why Moses was so angry when he comes down from the mountain and he sees the Israelites worshiping the golden calf. This was idolatry. This was pagan. And he comes down and he smashes the Ten Commandments, right? So there's this, they were very, very strict, very letter of the law, as we're going to see later on when we get into apologetics, and then next year as we get into liturgy and moral principles, we're going to see how they were very, very literal about these laws. The tabernacle and the two temples in Jerusalem form the first known examples of Jewish art. Now, yeah, they would decorate things, but before this time, there was really no settlement for the Jewish people. There were some settlements here and there, but they were kind of a wandering people. They didn't really have a settlement until about the 10th century BC. So they have, this is the Holy of Holies. Who knows what is in the Holy of Holies? The Ten Commandments. So the Ark of the Covenant is this object. So this is what we mean by the tabernacle, or sometimes this whole place is often referred to as the Holy of Holies. Sometimes it's called the tabernacle. That's not quite right. The Holy of Holies is the tabernacle. So sorry, what's in it again?
The Ten Commandments.
And the Ark, nope, the Ark of the Covenant is the thing.
Oh, what's...
And manna. Some manna.
What?
Mm-hmm. So they gathered up some manna, and they gathered up the Ten Commandments, and they put it in the Ark of the Covenant.
If we were to open it today, would we... Oh wait, do we even know where it is?
We don't know where it is. Nope.
What
It's,
was it? Like, what was
Right?
was
The-
it actually the Ten Commandments?
mm-hmm,
Gee, that's crazy.
mm-hmm.
When was the last time you knew where it was?
When the first temple was, I think it's when the first temple was destroyed. I think.
Was it destroyed too?
Wait, we
or-
don't know where it is right now?
No. I'm gonna look into that. I'm not sure. So when the Jews were wandering around the desert before they had their temple built, they carried the Ark of the Covenant with them, and it was in a procession. And there were priests who were in front of it and behind it, similar to how we do our processions today. And then when they would set up camp, they would put the Ark of the Covenant and set up a tent, and it would be divided into two places. So we're going to see this same sort of action taking place when we look at the temple itself. Now, there are two temples that were built. This is Solomon's temple. And this is Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Artist depiction, obviously. It's been destroyed. And there were two temples. The first temple was built in about the 10th century. So the first temple...
Sorry, Solomon's temple, the first temple or the second?
Second one.
What's the first temple called?
It was just called the temple.
Okay.
It's just the temple.
Oh, this was the...
I'm sorry, Solomon's temple. This is Solomon's temple.
Oh, it's the first. Second. Where is this? It's the first. Oh, I thought you just said it was second. It's the first.
So they're going to be very, very similar, right? The two temples are going to be very, very similar in design. So it's when we talk about Solomon's temple, people will refer to both temples as Solomon's temple because it was basically his design. I'm going to go back and review some of this just to make sure I'm telling you this stuff right, because this is a section I'm not too super familiar with. The second temple was built, so this one was destroyed in 586.
Wait, so...
Sorry, what is the first 10
Temple. 10th century.
10th century
But-
BC.
They're both Solomon's temple?
It was both. They were based on the design of Solomon, so they're both.
Is it all in a person?
Mm-hmm.
So okay.
Go ahead.
And then this was.
How does this depict him if he's a person?
It doesn't. He was one who built it.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Sorry, what year was it destroyed?
586.
How do you know these dates when you have like...
I don't have it on my paper. I just remember them.
Oh, Mr. Leonard.
I know. Okay, so we have this first temple. It was built. It was destroyed in 586. Remember the guy we talked about when we were talking about the ancient Near East guy named Nebuchadnezzar II?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so he comes in, he destroys Jerusalem, he conquers Jerusalem, and he destroys the temple. Okay? The Jews have this war, they finally kick him out, and then they rebuild the temple. Now, we cannot imagine what the temple meant to the Jewish people. There's no analogy for us today as to what the temple was. The closest thing you can probably come to is think about what would happen if the Capitol, the Vatican, and possibly like a whole downtown section of your city was destroyed in all one fell swoop. And let's say those three things were all the same thing. The temple was the center of religion. The temple was the center of your state. The temple was your whole being. And so for this to be destroyed is jaw-dropping. We can't imagine what it was like for the Jewish people. This is why when Christ is saying, the temple will be destroyed and in 3 days I will build it back up again. That's why the Jews were like, what are you talking about? Right? You're a terrorist. Right? So the temple was vital for not just the religious life of the Jews, but the civic life of the Jews. The temple was their identity. The temple was everything. It is interesting, the Jews at the time, when the temple was destroyed here in 586, they quickly had to build it back up again. This is where God was. This is why we call our tabernacles today, because the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, held the presence of God. They believed, and it is true, that the presence of God was in the temple. And it is true, he was. He was there. And he was there in the Holy of Holies. When the Jews started to stray away, there were some priests, good priests, good Jewish priests, who actually saw the presence of God leave the temple. God deserted the Jewish people. And this was, shortly after the building of the second temple. So about the year 300 or so BC. And they went, what are we doing? We're doing something wrong. Well, they had started to stray away from the true belief of the faith. They still held the faith, but they were getting much more interested in, following the letter of the law, right? In these minute details about how to live your life, instead of worshiping God. So the presence of God left.
So some, like, the good Jewish priests saw him.
Saw this cloud leave the temple and basically went up to the Mount of Olives and then disappeared. Now that's apocryphal. Did God actually leave? What, we don't know. But it seems to be it was a pretty strong signal. The good Jewish priests at the time said, well, then we have no choice but to repent and do better, or we wait for the Messiah to come. Anyway, that's all kind of backstory. One more piece of backstory. Have I told you about the stone that the temple was built on? Have I mentioned that before? Okay. The Jewish people very much believed that the creation of the world happened as it happened, but that this was basically the center of creation right here. That this spot, this mount, this is where the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. They believed that this is where Abraham received his dictate, his mandate to be the father of the Jewish people, of the Israelite nation. So this was the spot. They believed this was where he got his vision from God. And it may be so, we don't know. The temple was built on this very wide, very smooth rock that was on the top of a mountain. And you've been to the top of mountains before, even top of hills. Generally, there's not one big flat rock on the top of a hill, right? Usually there's crags and there's, it's not smooth. But there was this really smooth stone at the top of this mountain. And the Jewish people very much believed, is it true? We don't know, that this was the last stone of creation. This was like the keystone or the capstone that God placed on creation. He created everything else and then placed this stone there. This was their belief. And so they built this temple upon this rock.
It's one huge rock.
One huge rock. I'm going to say that again. They built this temple upon this rock. Like Peter. This is why when you go back to the Gospels and you read the Gospels, you have to understand what's going on at the time. You have to read the Gospels as if you're from that time. And it's impossible for us to do unless you're very smart and you've done decades of research. But when Christ tells Peter, I'm going on a tangent here, sorry. When Christ tells Peter, you are this rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. To the Jewish people, they're going to go, wait, what? Our temple is built on this rock, on this kephas, on this rock. Now Christ is saying, my temple is not here. My temple is no longer here. I will build my church upon not an actual physical rock, because again, the Jews said, this is where God is. He's here in a physical place, in a physical time, he's not anywhere else. Christ, instead of saying, I'm going to build my church on a person, on my soon-to-be vicar of Christ, on my people. It's not just for Jerusalem anymore. It's not just for the Jews anymore. It's for everyone. My church will be built upon the rock of souls, of people.
That's what
Right?
it's Peter.
That's what he meant. Peter's name was Simon Bar-Jonah. It wasn't Peter. Christ changed his name to Cephas. We translate that to Peter. So, again, sidebar, but all of these things kind of start to make sense. And if you can read Scripture with that mindset, it makes a lot more sense. Anyway, so let's get back to the art history. So the temple. There was this large courtyard, and at the entrance of the temple we have bronze depictions of these trees. There are two trees. The Garden of Eden was said to have the trees of life and of good and evil on the west side, and there were angels that were guarding the garden from the east. So these are depictions of the trees from the Garden of Eden.
The poles.
Yeah, they're like palm fronds. They're just very short. I don't know why they depict them that way, but young palms. The temple there's a lot of symbolism in the temple. The temple was meant to be the Garden of Eden, right? The place where God was with man. And God was in the temple, and men could go into the temple rarely. And so going into the temple was like going into the Garden of Eden, right? Where God could communicate with men and men could communicate with God. So that was the whole symbolism or point behind it. Mm-hmm.
The women go in there?
Nope.
Why was that?
They were not priests. Priests were only men from ancient times. In most cultures. Was that?
Should a normal day man go in then?
Mm-mm. Only the priests. The outer temple represents the outer world. And we have in front these two large objects. We have what's called the brazen sea. The brazen sea is basically, brazen means made out of brass. It's this huge chamber for water. And if you go back, you can see same thing, right? Same sort of thing here. When they're traveling, travel sized. But when you get into actually being able to build the temple, we have this large bronze, brazen sea. It was supported by 12 oxen, all facing in different directions. Some Catholic scholars have said, well, this is a prefiguration of the 12 apostles, each facing north, south, east, and west. I think that's a bit of a stretch. The Jews they used 12 quite often in their symbolism as well. So, I mean, maybe it is a prefiguration. I don't know. And then this was the place of sacrifice. So we have what's called the brazen altar of sacrifice, again, made out of brass. And there would be a fire lit underneath here. Now, it wouldn't go all the way down here. There's like a platform, but they would build a fire. And then during large ceremonies, especially during Passover or any large feast, people would bring their sacrifices up to the courtyard. The priest would take them and place them on here, and then they would be burned and sent up.
What? People are allowed to watch it.
Mm-hmm.
What does the brazen say?
I'm sorry, the brazen sea. Before offering sacrifice, the priests were meant to wash themselves, purify themselves. So this was basically like a finger bowl, a really big finger bowl, right? So they'd go in and they'd wash themselves. There was a whole anointing process. There was a whole ceremony for that. They would anoint their hands, their feet, their head.
Were women allowed in the outer courtyard?
Not sure. I don't know that. But broadly speaking, I mean, especially during times of Passover when there's 100,000 people coming in, there's not going to be room in there for people anyway. And so you would come up to the side, and it doesn't show it here. This shows like a very big wall, but there was a lower wall, about waist high, where you could come and hand your sacrifice to the priest, and that's how the priest would get it. So you wouldn't necessarily be going into the courtyard. I'm not sure if everyday people were allowed in there or not. I don't know. So everyday people were not allowed in the temple. When we say that people were going into the temple, we're talking about the courtyard, right? The courtyard. Everyday people were not allowed inside those doors. Okay. And there were other rooms as time goes on. There were other rooms and other buildings around, obviously. So the money changers in the courtyard. This is where it would have been, right?
I don't know how to word this question, but if Catholics were to still do traditions like this,
Mm-hmm.
like the burning and the sacrificing of stuff, would that be why don't we do that anymore? Why do we stop doing that?
Because of Christ's new covenant. He basically said, don't, by instituting the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist, by doing his passion and death on the cross, he stopped the process of sacrificing things, earthly creatures, and now he has given himself as the perfect sacrifice. So if you want to offer, like let's say you're a sheep farmer and you want to offer your sheep to God and you sacrifice it, it's fine, you could. But it's no longer a fitting or a perfect sacrifice for God. He's given us the perfect sacrifice. So it's kind of like, well, why would we do that then? Right? It's kind of like when you make a sacrifice yourself of, I'm going to give this up or do this. It's still good. It's still pleasing to God, right? You're still giving something up for God, but he's basically given us himself to give up, right? So he's kind of changed the narrative. Okay. We have these other basins here for priests to be able to wash themselves. So it was a whole ceremony. We have this outer section of the building as well. Now this is just cut away. But there would be, let me see if I have notes on this. I don't. Shoot, I used to know what that extra section was for. I think it's just for upkeep of the temple.
On the left?
Yeah, that cutout area. Because it kind of goes up like this, and then it goes like this. I don't remember what that outer section is for. Sorry, I don't remember. I had a point in putting that slide in there. I don't remember now. Anyway, let's move to the inside. The inside was brass and gold and paint to look like brass and gold. And it was beautiful inside. It was breathtaking from what we understand. So inside we have, that's what it was, storage rooms. Storage room for the priests. So that's where you would put all your stuff, your extra candles or your extra, incense or whatever. So that was like your outer room. And so attendants could go in there and grab things for the priests. But generally speaking, it was only priests who were allowed inside this first room. So inside we have this large room overlaid with gold and bronze, decorated with palm trees and flowers, symbolizing the Garden of Eden. So again, no depictions of people. It's all plants and kind of mythological creatures, mythological symbols. You're going to see as we move forward in the temple, I don't know if you can see this, but these depictions of these winged lions, right? These were added onto the second temple. The Jews are starting to kind of borrow some of these motifs, some of these designs from the ancient Near East and, as we're going to see, from Egypt.
Well,
So they're, yeah.
Sorry, the winged lion, isn't that part of the
Who is it, Mark?
4 pillars, Mark?
That's New Testament. So
But
this
that didn't
was,
mean anything at this
it
time?
didn't mean anything. So, why are they putting some of these depictions of ancient Near East and Egyptian art in here? We don't know. Maybe it was like, we've beaten them, or, I don't know. I'm not too much of an expert in this, but you can see over here these winged lions as well, very much ancient Near East. Inside there were 12 large menorah. So menorah are candlesticks, basically 7-branched candlesticks. You see those all the time when you see depictions of Hanukkah. They still use those today.
I thought there was 8. There's 9.
Depends. Depends. In this time there were 7. Sometimes there's 8, but the traditional old school menorah is 7.
Why?
Because I'll do the best.
Because it goes back to the time when what was it for? The Maccabees.
Judas says, the Holocaust.
Yeah, the whole
No.
That's my thought.
It was the lamps. They ran out of oil and they needed to have their lamps still lit for 7 days or 7 nights. And God kept the lamp burning. It was some miracle like that. I don't remember exactly.
You're right.
And so they use these 7 branches of the candlestick. That's where Hanukkah comes from, right? This idea of where God's providence is seeing us through these times. So inside we have this. Inside we have. Oops, I'm going to go back. Sorry. We have this small altar where incense is kept burning at all times, and then through those main doors is what's called the Holy of Holies. That inner section is very smoky in there.
Sorry, wait. We're looking at, would you be stepping down, or is that the
That's going up, and that's going into the Holy of Holies. The entrance is behind us.
Would it be be up or would it be ground level?
Probably down a few more steps, something like that.
Like square thing.
That's like an incense burner. So incense was kept on there all the time. We also have 12 loaves that were put in the temple, and they were replaced every Sabbath. So every Saturday, the priest would go in, they would be lighting incense, and there would be 12 loaves that were placed on the side. And then after a week of them being there, then the priest would eat them in a ceremonial fashion. This was to symbolize God's providence. Yeah, it'd get kind of stale. This was to symbolize God's providence of him leading them through the desert with the manna. And so again, there's all this symbolism behind it.
So how do you get inside those doors? That was impossible to get in.
Very heavy door. Inside is the Holy of Holies, and this is where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. And one priest, the high priest, was allowed to go in there once a year. That's it. The rest of the time, it was priests who, I don't know, maybe he did some sweeping while he was in there. But otherwise, they were in this section of the temple, doing their weekly, work.
You have a picture of it?
Of what?
Holy Homes.
Yeah.
What was you doing there?
They would be offering sacrifice to God. So all the sacrifice is going on outside, and the priest would take some incense, and he's basically carrying the sacrifice from outside in and presenting it to God from on the inside.
So
Yeah.
there's only one
Temple.
At the time, there's only one temple.
There's only
It's
one
not
temple.
multiple.
This is why it was important for the Jews to travel to Jerusalem to go to the temple at least once a year. If you could,
But they
you had to
couldn't
go.
inside anyways.
They couldn't go inside.
Only the Day of Atonement, so like, what's that?
Yom Kippur? Or no, Rosh Hashanah? One of the two. I don't
Sorry,
remember.
what day was? What do they have like temples now?
Mm-mm.
What do they have? What's something?
Synagogues.
What's in a synagogue?
Where is Jews?
It's just a place of prayer. We'll talk about that.
Where is pulpit? Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Where do the
All right, so
Jews
how
live?
big, I'm sorry?
Where do the Jews live?
Everywhere. A lot of them are in
No,
Israel.
but where is this at?
This is in Jerusalem.
Jews are the Oreos of Jerusalem?
Mhm.
Hold on, just like,
Jews are
do
like
we know where this was?
Yes.
Is there still a big stone?
It's like, yeah.
We don't
It's like
know.
where Catholics
It's
Yeah.
way underneath by this point. All right, so how big was it? How big was it? It was, the outer temple was 40 cubits long. The whole thing was about 60 cubits. This is 30, this is 20. How big is a cubit? A cubit is basically a foot and a half.
Isn't it how big the king's foot was?
I think that was later. That was later.
That's huge.
So 30 cubits is about 45 feet tall. So it's a little bit taller than, from floor to ceiling, it's a little bit taller than our tower. So it's a little bit taller than our tower. Not huge,
Giraffe.
but it was very imposing. It's about 35 feet tall, I think. I asked your dad this 2 years ago when I was doing this class. I was like, what was it? I think he said 35. It's around that.
Yeah.
All right, so we have the inside.
34.5.
We have the inside incense. We have the outside brazen altar of sacrifice. And again, the incense on the inside was meant to be kind of carrying in.
Did they like eat any of the animals after? Because that would taste really good.
No.
Take a chicken bone off.
No.
That is legit. Okay,
Because it's What? ours.
So this is inside the Holy of Holies. You can see how the Jewish people are taking.
That's Egyptian.
Yep, absolutely.
Wait, why would they put Egyptian stuff next to the Holy of Holies? That doesn't make any sense. They put pagan Egyptian stuff.
Wait, if only the high people died in there, how'd they build it?
So
So
it would be the tabernacle would be taken and put somewhere else, and then they built it, and then it was consecrated like we consecrate a church today.
You know how much that would be worth?
Untold. I mean, there's no price to it. All right, so that's the temple. And again, the last.
It's all solid gold, all of it?
Yeah, the inner room was covered in gold as well. The ark was guarded by 2 more cherubim.
Like angels?
Hmm. And so they stylized it. They just stole the.
Egyptian angels.
What do angels look like,
We don't know.
Eyeballs with wings.
right?
Choose.
Eyeballs with wings.
But isn't there like a group of angels that have multiple wings?
That's kind of artist depictions. We don't know. I mean, yes, it says that in scriptures, but it's meant to be allegorical. All right. So to your question, I think, Ellie, where do Jews worship today? You know, if you couldn't go to the temple, where would you go? Well, to the synagogue. The synagogue is basically a place of, or that was your question? I'm sorry. The synagogue was a place of, you can kind of think of it, it's sort of the same as going to like a Protestant church. So like if you guys have been in like the 91st Psalm church, right? What is it? There's no tabernacle, right? There's no,
They got
there,
some drums.
there obviously is no presence of God, but they don't even say that there is a presence of God. What is it? It's a place of gathering, of worship,
Unity.
and you're not worshiping anything in there, you're worshiping God, right? So you're gathering together and you're worshiping together. There's some scripture readings, there's some things like that. The synagogue is basically this. The synagogue is led by a rabbi who's a teacher. He's not a priest necessarily, he could be, according to the Jewish tradition. But he's a rabbi. What does rabbi mean? Teacher, right? This is why if you read the scriptures, the disciples call Christ rabbi, because he was a teacher. And so the synagogue is, again, it's a meeting place. So you would go to the synagogue on the Sabbath and you would read, and there was really no other ceremonies other than, certain rites of forgiveness or certain, like the bar mitzvah, you get to be age 12 or a bat mitzvah, things like that. But basically when you go to church, when you go to synagogue, there's reading, there's music. It's basically the Mass of the catechumens. The Mass of the catechumens is very similar to what a synagogue service looks like.
Did they have drums and guitars like 91st Psalm?
They had ram's horns, which are even cooler.
Yeah.
A guy who taught me how to play a saxophone back in high school. He was the band teacher for the local public school, and he's a Jewish guy.
Ram horn.
And he could play any instrument. He's just one of those guys who's naturally talented, could play anything. And I was like, hey, what are you doing today, Mr. Sickle? He's like, oh, I'm going to go into the synagogue and play the ram's horn. I was like, play the what now? He goes, no, yeah, it's an actual. He showed me. Basically, it's a trumpet mouthpiece. Oh, look online, you can see it. It's a trumpet mouthpiece, and they just stick it into a ram's horn.
Where do they get the ram's horn?
Is it curly?
From a ram.
Is it curly?
Yeah.
Can you show us a video?
We're running out of time.
I said the ram.
Yep. You just chop off the
Is she
tip.
curly?
Okay, so this is one of the older synagogues that we still have in existence today.
It's like,
The Beth Alpha Synagogue. There's lots of menorahs. There's lots of menorahs. There's lots of mosaics.
those look like haystacks.
The outline of the walls and the floor are preserved. But we love looking at this floor, at this mosaic floor.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, it's amazing.
This is one of the best depictions of ancient Jewish art that we can find outside of Jerusalem.
This looks like sausages.
So we see. So this is a menorah. I think it's meant to be kind of like curvy, I don't know, spirally.
Yeah, meant to be.
But again, we see depictions of animals, we see depictions of nature, we see no depictions of man, right? We see not even any words at this point. This is something I actually want to dive into because I'm a nerd, and so I downloaded a 41-page paper on zodiac and the Jewish religion.
You gonna make us read it?
I'm not going to make you read it.
I'm a Capricorn.
Okay, zodiac.
But there's people.
Oh, zodiac signs? Like,
Zodiac signs.
Oh,
The-
really? The monkey and bull.
So from what I've been able to read so far, in earlier times, there was looking at astrological symbols and trying to find meaning in astrological symbols was absolutely prohibited
we get like the Libra,
by
Scorpio.
the Jews.
That's cool.
But it seems that during this, what's called the Second Talmudic Age, which is basically around the time of Christ, and shortly after, that there was kind of this interest in, not in worshiping and not trying to find signs, but seeing the zodiac as sort of God's providence, right? There's this, God has divided up the days and the times and the heavens and all of this stuff and the signs and the stars. And so, yeah, let's go ahead and use the astrological symbols to, learn about nature and also to show God's providence and to worship him more. In the same way that, when we look at pictures from the James Webb Space Telescope, we go, that's cool, look at what God created. That's sort of what they're doing here, from what I understand, but I'm going to read more about it.
Which one's January?
It's not necessarily months. Do you have a question?
It's in touch.
I guess more of like why, I've always wondered why that's like a big deal, like I guess within like Catholic religion, like talking about zodiac signs.
Yeah.
It's always been like a taboo thing that you don't do, even though like, it's just like, some people just do it for fun. Like I just
Right.
think it's fun. Like it's like,
Yeah.
oh, the stars, and it's cool. Like, oh, this is my star for my month. And like,
Right.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah, so as long as you don't, I think the reason why Catholics are concerned about diving too much into zodiac and astrology and that kind of stuff is like, well, I can't go out and do anything today because Jupiter is in retrograde with Venus or something like that, right? Obviously you don't want to do that because you have free will, right? In terms of your symbol, well, I'm a Libra, that means I am more, I have no idea about any of this stuff, so I'm just making this up. I am compassionate, but I'm also prone to anger. Well, am I really, because I was born during this time?
Yep, absolutely.
Maybe there's some sort of minute reason for that, but again, what does that do? That kind of lowers our ability to say, I have free will, right? Oh, I couldn't help myself. I'm a Libra. No. Stop making excuses. Have free will, right? Make good decisions. What? What's that? There's Gemini. Yeah. There's Scorpio. So I think that's why. It's like, you want to have fun with it, fine, but don't make it, well, this is my identity, therefore I can't help it, right? Your identity is Catholic first, right? It shows a Torah shrine. There's lots of ritual objects. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. You can read through this. I'm not going to take a ton of time on it. But please do read through it so you understand it. Okay?
That's adorable.
But bottom line, what you really need to understand is mosaics. There's a lot of mosaics. There's not a lot of painting, or at least that we still have. And also that whole area was decimated by the Romans. So there's not a lot that still exists. All right, really quickly, we're just going to talk about the fall of Rome. I know we've already finished Rome, but it's important for us to understand as we get into Christian and then into the Byzantine period. This period is kind of what I like to call the shift to Byzantium. So we have Jerusalem over here, right? We've been talking about Rome. We've been talking about Greece. Towards the, what's the date here? 267. So this is 267 AD, right? The temple has been destroyed. The Romans have taken over everything. And right around about the year 200, they're at the height of their power. What happens when an empire gets too big?
It divides.
It collapses or divides. Why?
Because there's not enough, there's so much room,
There's
there's
not
not
enough-
enough people
yeah.
to like manage it.
Especially if it's a monarchy or an emperor. You can't be in all places at one time, right? You have to rely on, and especially before, communications, right? Before good communications, how do you communicate with your generals up in Trier if you're down in Rome? How do you communicate with someone down in Alexandria? That's 3 weeks' journey, right? Exactly.
Is that bigger than America, all that land and stuff?
It's probably about the same, would be my rough guess.
Okay. But the communications.
But communications, right, still sucks. So how do you manage it? Well, at the time, they said, well, we're just going to divide it in half. It's still going to be Rome, but there's going to be East Rome and there's going to be West Rome. So Rome, and then there's going to be what we're going to call Byzantium. And when the Romans kind of cut this up, now obviously Byzantium as a whole existed. Byzantium was the city, and it was a very powerful city. But they what the Romans did is kind of said, all right, this is East, and it's going to be under the control of Byzantium, which later becomes Constantinople. So Constantinople and Rome are going to be kind of the two linchpins for thousands of years. Thousands? 1,500-ish. Constantine comes along, and he regroups and he rebuilds everything. And he says, now, everything is going to be under one ruler. It's going to be me. When is this? This is around the year 315, 327, something like that.
80?
Uh-huh. And he moves the capital of the Roman Empire to Byzantium, renames it Constantinople after himself. Rome is still important. There's still the Senate there and all this kind of stuff. But this is really, when Rome is cut in half, when the Roman Empire is cut in half, this is really the beginning of the end. It was already starting to fail. The outer edges of the empire were starting to crumble. There was lots of skirmishes and things like that. Constantine obviously did great things for Christianity. He brought all of Rome under Christianity. So the Edict of Milan happened in 327. This was this basically peace treaty between the Roman Empire and the Christians. It ended the persecutions, and it made Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire. But it didn't last too long. The end of the Roman Empire was in the early 500s, I think 520 something, right? So it didn't last too long, and Rome is really starting, as a civil society, Rome is really starting to crumble at this time. But Constantine's going to do everything he can to keep it alive and keep it going. We can kind of see what was happening, right? Over time, we have
All one empire?
Over time, basically Rome collapses. So this is after the collapse of the Roman Empire. And then we have the Byzantine Empire. So I skipped over a little bit. We have Rome that's divided west and east. Constantine brings it back all in together. By the time Constantine is done, they say, well, hey, the previous guy had a good idea. Let's again split it apart. Western Rome starts to fall and crumble, and then the Byzantine Empire over here in the east starts to basically usurp control. And so basically, we have this balance of power shifting from Rome, overseeing everything. Now it's split. Now Byzantine is taking over, or Constantinople. They rename it back to Byzantium, parts of it, and then they start to take it back, everything over. Okay, that's your very rough 500 years in a nutshell, kind of how things are going. So Rome is still going to be important. Ravenna is actually going to become more important for a time. We're going to talk about that when we talk about Byzantine and early medieval. But Constantinople is going to be the preeminent city in this whole area. And so instead of the Roman Empire, now we have the Byzantine Empire. And that exists for a time, which we'll get into. These are just some kind of last gasps. The Colossus of Constantine, right? This is this statue that he built of himself to try to kind of recapture the grandeur and the importance of Rome.
Goodness. Is this a vein
That
in his
is
arm?
disconnected.
Big statue. He's undergoing all of these public projects in Rome at the time. He's trying to basically buy people's affection, buy people's because people are getting restless, people are getting upset. And people in Rome are feeling like, well, you're ignoring everything, and you're going over here to Constantinople. What about us? So he builds these amazing basilicas and these rebuilding projects. This is still near the Roman Forum today. We saw this when we were looking at the Roman Forum, but this is the Basilica of Maxentius. It was built at the time. And he puts his statue, the Colossus of Constantine, he puts it in front of it. Hey, I'm still here. It was huge. It was probably 35, 40 feet tall.
Was he not like transphobic?
Yeah. So the Basilica of Maxentius, it was huge. It was the largest basilica constructed. And again, this was Constantine's kind of last gasp to, hey, I'm still important. I'm still here. The grandeur of Rome is still here, but it's going to start to fall apart pretty quickly afterwards. All right. Next. Christian.
Next. Mr. Lincoln's channel.
Next.